In this video, we are going to talk about inflation is on rise. So, before starting the video, please like this video. Do subscribe and turn on the notification to our channel, and check out my Instagram and Twitter at IronCorman for future updates. Inflation has arrived. Prices jumped across the board in November, according to the most recent Consumer Price Index (CPI) inflation report, by large margin. Overall, prices increased 6.8% year-over-year, the most since June 1982, and increased 0.8% month-over-month. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, higher costs were broad-based, with significant rises in the indices for gasoline, accommodation, food, and new and used automobiles. In November, the fuel index alone increased by 6.1%. Of course, those products are essential to the everyday financial lives of ordinary Americans, straining their budget even more. When volatile food and energy costs were removed from the equation, so-called core CPI inflation, the situation became somewhat brighter. Prices increased by 0.5% in November, somewhat less than the previous month, and by 4.9% over the previous year. Although the Fed uses a different inflation gauge, PCE inflation, this is substantially beyond the Federal Reserve's 2% target. As every motorist will tell, certain factors played a significant role in these remarkable advances. New car sales increased by 1.1% in the last month, and are now 11.1% higher than a year ago. In November, grocery prices were 0.8% higher than in October, maintaining an upward trend. Food prices have risen by 6.1% in the last year. During the same time period, housing costs have increased by 3.8%, while energy expenditures have increased by 33.3%. Americans who have just gone to the grocery store or begun their holiday shopping may have noticed a rise in consumer costs. According to the Consumer Price Index, the annual rate of inflation in the United States reached 6.2% in October 2021, the highest in more than 3 decades, CPI. Other inflation indicators have also increased significantly in recent months, though not to the same amount as the CPI. Understanding why inflation has risen so swiftly should help policymakers figure out how long the spike will stay and what, if anything, they should do about it. The recent increase in inflation looks to be fundamentally different from previous bouts of inflation that were more directly linked to the regular business cycle. Continued disruptions in global supply chains due to the coronavirus pandemic, labor market turmoil, the fact that today's prices are being compared to prices during last year's COVID-19 induced shutdowns, and strong consumer demand after local economies were reopened are some of the explanations offered so far. At the very least, one thing is clear: a rebounding inflation rate is not just an issue for the United States. According to a Pew Research Center review of data from 46 countries, the inflation rate in the third quarter of 2021 was greater, in most of them, 39, than it was in the pre-pandemic third quarter of 2019. In the third quarter of 2021, the United States had the 9th highest annual inflation rate among the 46 countries studied, just edging out Poland. The increase in the United States inflation rate, 3.58 percentage points between the third quarter of 2019 and the third quarter of 2021, was the third highest in the study group, trailing only Brazil and Turkey, both of which have significantly higher inflation rates than the United States. Regardless of the absolute level of inflation in each country, many follow a similar pattern: relatively low inflation before the COVID-19 pandemic hit in the first quarter of 2020. Flat or falling inflation for the rest of the year and into 2021, as many governments sharply curtailed most economic activity. And rising inflation in the second and third quarters of this year, as the world struggled to return to something resembling normal. In most of the countries studied, the year 2021 marked the end of an exceptionally long period of low to moderate inflation. In reality, 34 of the 46 countries studied had average inflation rates of 2.6% or less in the decade preceding the epidemic. In 27 of these countries, inflation was less than 2% on average. Argentina was the biggest outlier, with its economy beset by high inflation and other maladies for decades. The OECD does not have data on Argentine inflation rates prior to 2018, although it averaged 44.4% from 2018 to 2019. Japan, on the other hand, has fought for more than 2 decades with stubbornly low inflation and occasional deflation, or dropping prices. With varying degrees of success, Japan's inflation rate was weak at 0.7% in the first quarter of 2020. It entered deflationary zone in the last quarter of 2020 and has been there ever since. Consumer prices were 0.2% lower in the third quarter of this year than in the third quarter of 2020. A few other countries have deviated from the general trend of dips and surges. Inflation in Iceland and Russia, for example, has been continuously rising throughout the pandemic, not only in recent months. In Indonesia, inflation began to decline early on and has stayed low. Mexico's inflation rate dipped significantly during the 2020 shutdown, swiftly rebounded, reaching 5.8% in the third quarter of 2021, the highest since the fourth quarter of 2017. In Saudi Arabia, the pattern was reversed. The country's inflation rate soared during the pandemic's peak, but then plummeted to only 0.4% in the most recent quarter. When rising inflation first became a problem in the spring of 2021, the Fed offered several explanations, including base effects, supply chain difficulties, and a thorny labor market. The most obvious explanation for high price growth is base effects. That is, as state governments instituted lockdowns in an attempt to slow the spread of COVID throughout 2020, prices plummeted. And any year-over-year comparison was going to appear absurd when people resumed spending more as life returned to normal. The earliest evidence of this was in the cost of airline tickets. When the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, demand for travel fell precipitously, resulting in a price decline. For example, airfares plummeted 24% year-over-year in April 2020, and they would remain at these low levels for the remainder of the year. Prices are still being messed up by supply chain concerns. Take, for example, used automobiles and trucks. While prices fell when the economy entered a downturn, used vehicles and trucks did not become less expensive than they were in February 2020. They've never been more expensive, in fact. To be clear, the reasons for the increase are related to the pandemic. New car manufacturing has been hampered by a continuous chip shortage, individuals are keeping their leases longer, and rental car companies, a significant supplier of second-hand cars, have fewer vehicles to unload after restricting their inventory when the epidemic arrived. Furthermore, folks who put off buying a car last year are now competing for them now. So, that's it for today's video. What are your thoughts on our video? Please let us know in comments section below. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear from me again, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification to our channel before you go. Thank you so much for watching.